as a way of introducing this panel, I had a series of thoughts and a series of reflections, and because I'm basically working from a Lacanian orientation, I started to think about the various Lacanian motifs that we could try and invoke and apply to thinking about what COVID-19 is all about. I had a series of them, but one of the first that came to mind was this whole odd phenomenon of face-as-phallus, we might put it. And when I'm talking about face-as-phallus, I mean, of course, something we're all familiar with, the ongoing political debates about mask wearing, and of course, Donald Trump's refusal to wear a mask. And of course, we could try to speculatively develop some of these thoughts and suggest that maybe partly what is funny about this situation, or odd, is that Donald Trump seems particularly reticent to wear a mask where any members of the news media might be able to capture an image of him in a state of partial face castration. Now, of course, that may sound all a little bit silly, thinking about face castration and face-as-phallus in COVID. But then again, there's a sense in which Donald Trump's message is very much about attaining a state of uncastrated narcissistic fullness, about finding culprits for the theft of enjoyment, and about reinstating a phantasmatic image of American greatness. So thinking about that, I set about to design a yard sign. I'm a little bit new to the American suburbs, so I'm new to the whole yard sign phenomena, and I decided I was going to try and design a yard sign which would adequately reflect some of my psychoanalytic thoughts. A few of my early efforts, alas, were consigned to the trash heap fairly early on. I kind of came up with one which said, "Make America erect again," but that felt both a little bit salacious and maybe a little disrespectful, so I consigned that one to the trash heap. After a little bit more reflection, I came to another formulation, which I thought was a nice distillation of psychoanalytic theory. And my poster just said, "Donald Trump is a prick." But then I thought my neighbors wouldn't like it. And I was very relieved to find that someone had beat me to it. So I'm not sure if you can see that. But I found out that some people have already had some creative editorial input on the Trump Pence sign, and through a little bit of creative re-editing, they have changed the words Trump Pence into what is undoubtedly, I think, a more correct message, and I'll cite them: "I pump penis." A second motif, a little bit more seriously this time, not so mocking. At the beginning of the coronavirus period, I received a text message from a member of my family. And the text message said something like this: it warned that the virus can live on and on and on for many days on most surfaces, and that we should take particular care to keep it off of our face. Keep it off your face, because it's often linked to respiratory difficulties. The first Lacanian association I had to that message, which is one which wants to highlight the elasticity of the threat of the virus. And it seemed to also incur a sense of the uncanny parameters of life that the virus embodied. It made me think of Lacan's myth of lamella. And of course, that is developed in Lacan's 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. And it's his dramatization in a kind of mythical form of how Freud's notion of libido entails a kind of voracious, indestructible life that is also lethal. So at the risk of some gratuitous paraphrasing, allow me to note what Lacan has to say about lamella. He says, lamella is something which is extra flat. It moves like the amoeba. It goes everywhere. It is, like an amoeba, immortal. It survives any division, any intervention, and it can run around. Well, says Lacan, this is not very reassuring. Suppose it comes and envelops your face. I can't see how we would not join battle with a being capable of these properties, but it would not be a very convenient battle. This lamella, this organ, whose characteristic is not to exist, is the libido. It is the libido as pure life instinct, that is to say, it's immortal life, irrepressible life. And it is of this that all the forms of the object A that can be enumerated are the representatives, the equivalents. So you may say that's a suggestive, interesting, perhaps resonant passage, but maybe not all that analytically useful. I don't know how far it gets us to think about coronavirus as lamella, but I think maybe what's most instructive about that passage is less the idea that we should think coronavirus as lamella, but the idea that anything that seems to instantiate lamella is also going to set in play this object cause. The object A is going to be a stimulant to anxiety and to desire. So perhaps with that suggestive idea in mind, we can turn to one of the topics I really wanted to focus on here. And that might change our direction somewhat, because one of the questions that confounded me and still confounds me about corona is, why are some of us not more concerned? Or we could say, how is it that it's been so easy to downplay and to minimize COVID, both personally, psychologically, we could say, and politically? And upon a little bit of comparative history, you could say there's been other periods of notable historical disruption in the United States. And relative to them, the upheavals of our coronavirus crisis don't seem to have been afforded quite such a punctuum-inducing image in quite the same way. And just with a little bit of speculative memory, we can think about images of 9/11, kind of primal scene of the trauma of 9/11. You can think about the images that the photojournalism that turned America against the Vietnam War. We can think of multiple, the Challenger disaster. You can think of multiple examples where there's been a kind of sticking, an imaginarization of the events, which seem to, in many respects, have represented a kind of turning point in popular opinion, and also galvanized a certain political will to do something or to respond. So my first assertion then is simply to say that the coronavirus thus far seems to have avoided a stabilizing imaginarization in Lacanian theory. That is, it hasn't been fixed to a definitive kind of image, and as a result, we could say that it has induced a spectral effect of subjective and social dislocation. And if we had more room, we could think a little bit about, why is that the case? Why is it that it's so difficult to imagine or fix in a kind of imaginarized image that gives the coronavirus some stability? If we had to think about it, I thought of a series where I thought there was a potential of images becoming kind of a haunting, constant reference, a kind of iconic image in the American and global consciousness. For me, one of them early on was there was a whole series of trucks with bodies, refrigerated trucks just out of New York City. And I'd wondered whether that would be one of those images. But it seems not to have stuck for whatever reason, both because of political will and maybe very possibly because it's not particularly comforting or easy to centralize those images. Just as a brief aside on that note, I suppose what you could say is that the closest we seem to have got to an iconic image of corona and coronavirus is maybe all of the face-as-phallus stuff that I've been speaking about. It's the mask. So we see lots of kind of comedic images of masks on dinosaurs, masks all over the place. But that still leaves open that space where one might have hoped for a kind of more punctuum-inducing imaginarization or image of coronavirus. Now, importantly, it's not just about an image, an iconic image that may have given it some kind of symbolic loading. It's also about the fact, I think, that COVID has not just avoided imaginarization, but it seems to a certain extent also to have avoided a kind of definitive symbolic registration. Now, that's changed somewhat since I started writing the paper, because we talk about it a lot, it's in the news media a lot, but you could say there's also something about COVID which seems to elude that symbolic registration, in as much as the big other of science, governmental authorities, even biopolitical experts, remain somewhat confounded by corona. Now, having said all that, it's important, I think, just to stress that there are, of course, millions of households that have been plunged into conditions of economic precarity because of what's going on. So I'm in no way denying that. Although what I'm also saying is that it's odd to me, and I count myself in this category, that there's millions of others who still experience, if not phantasmatic disbelief in what's happening, then a sense that they are very much spectators who will remain largely unchanged by this epoch-defining crisis. And I'm not simply taking aim here at conservative politicians or conservative public discourse, because yesterday afternoon, when I was putting pen to paper to finish, not start, I heard that, not start, finish writing this paper, I just reflected for a little bit, and it seems to me, to be totally honest, that I somehow got to this point of thinking it's not going to affect me. I'm somehow, I've managed to get through the summer, and I've managed to get through the first 8 weeks of my semester back at university. And it just occurred to me that at some level, not hugely consciously, but I was making the assumption that I somehow think that I'm immune to it. So I think this kind of spectral condition of avoidance of disavowal is perhaps fairly widespread. And I think it'd be interesting to offer some ideas as to why that may be. I'm cognizant that I've only got a few more minutes, so instead of developing a whole series of other ideas, I will just briefly mention some interesting contributions by the Brazilian Lacanian psychoanalyst Gabriel Tupinambá. He offered some thoughts on coronavirus, and he does so via brief reference to Freud's Beyond the Pleasure principle. And of course, the paradox he picks up that Freud develops there is that in instances of combat trauma, war trauma, what Freud notes is that it's paradoxical, that it's sometimes the people who've had a flesh wound or that have sustained some kind of material bodily wound that are best able to deal with the ongoing lingering effects of the trauma. The idea here almost seems to be that if one has paid the price of a physical wound, then somehow the contours of the trauma become more manageable, easier to deal with. So Tupinambá puts it in these terms. He says, speaking with a Lacanian term of reference, being injured in such or similar situations brings with it a sort of subjective relief of being marked by the situation, he says. The faceless threat is somehow shaped into a manageable individual measure, giving some limits to the fantasy. So we might say, without paying the price of such a flesh wound, of a really experienced loss, maybe it's not just a wound to oneself, maybe it's a loss of someone or someone in one's extended family, the threat in question remains spectral, underdefined, difficult to concretize, and thereby omnipresent. Subversion takes up this idea and he reframes it in the following terms, which I think is a kind of useful way of approaching it. He says, the moment this spectral agency becomes part of our reality, even if it means catching the virus, part of our immediate, familial, or material reality, its power is localized. It becomes something we can deal with, even if we lose the battle. As long as this transposition into reality cannot take place, we get trapped either in anxious paranoia or resort to ineffective symbolizations through acting outs that expose us to unnecessary risks. It occurred to me that this idea of the spectral condition, the avoidance, the disavowal, the denial that often characterize this particular form of anxiety, it's not just about one's position and one's sense of belief and one's fantasy, it's also about what we could call corona temporality. And let me conclude then by saying that it seems to me that there are a number of interesting things we could say about COVID temporality. And just reflecting back a little bit on the previous era, you could say, of the lockdown, as it was called in many nations, you could say that that suspended animation, that particular temporality of lockdown, seemed to chafe against the phantasmatic, anticipatory impetus that this will all soon be over. And of course, we see this with politicians promising us by the end of the year, we're going to have this vaccine. And just to develop that a little bit, one, of course, it's not just that we have this anticipatory rush to try to get to some kind of phantasmatic solution to where we're at. There's also now increasingly, and I'm sure you've all experienced this retroactive sense of, oh, remember the time pre-COVID, before this all happened. And that sense of experiences now starts to take on a slightly different loading. So my assertion then is that we are in spectral times. It's not just a spectral condition of how we deal with the anxiety or alleviate or attempt to avoid it, but there's also a question of the spectral temporality of COVID. And my conclusion is simply to say, looking at and thinking about how we might understand something of this odd spectral temporality made me think about two things. It made me think about Antonio Gramsci and Gramsci's notion of the interregnum. which is a notion, of course, he takes from ancient Rome. But the interregnum is an interesting way of thinking the temporality of transitional periods. An interregnum is a period of discontinuity, a gap in organization or social order in government. And here's his quote, an oft-cited quote from Gramsci, which seemed to me to be kind of pertinent. He says, and I quote him, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot yet be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." Seems to me a very applicable quote. There's some translations or developments of that quote which slightly vary the idea. The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying, the new cannot be born. The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. I do kind of prefer the great variety of morbid symptoms appear. In my last minute then, I just want to suggest what might be a nice piece of intertextuality is to overlap that with a citation from Lacan. So Gramsci gives us this political time of the interregnum. I've been trying to think a little bit about retroactivity, psychoanalytic notions of temporality, and that idea of the interregnum combines nicely with an assertion that Lacan makes when he's talking about the temporality of the subject of the unconscious in his paper, Subversion of the Subject. And he has this memorable phrase, he's musing on Freud's famous wo es war, soll ich werden, the famous quote, "There where I was, it shall come to be." That's one rendering of it. And Lacan gives this quote. He says, "Where it was just now, where it was for a short while, between an extinction that is still glowing and an opening up that stumbles, I come into being." It seems to me so fascinating to overlap that with Gramsci and see if we can think both the political register and the psychoanalytic register of COVID temporality. But I'm going to stop there.